Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, whoever's doing that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name, again, is Pam Warren. I'm a Vice President of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host today. Viewers, thank you for joining us. As you know, our club does a great job of providing a forum for business, political, and cultural leaders to share their ideas with us. Our club strives to offer you a diversity of speakers who address current issues. We are conscious of Canada's rich diversity and strive to reflect this not only in topics, but in the speakers who present them. Today's panel is no exception. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of today's sponsor, CIBC. Thank you very much. I would also like to recognize the youth and young leaders who are joining us today from Ryerson's Leadership Lab. Where are you guys? Thank you. Now let me introduce our panel. The Ontario Human Rights Commission defines bias as a predisposition, prejudice, or generalization about a group of persons based on personal characteristics or stereotypes. Our unconscious mind stores past experiences, learnings, and thoughts that can shape our pattern of thinking. As human beings, we are influenced by our biases, whether they may be conscious or unconscious. The impact of unconscious bias may account for questionable decision-making that can impact organizational reputation. I know that our panelists have a lot to say on the issue, and let's hear from them now. Joining us are Renée Bazile-Jones. Ms. Bazile-Jones has established a strong reputation for her work in diversity management, strategic planning, and change management. Her expertise includes workplace harassment and unconscious bias. Scott Campbell. Mr. Campbell is a founding partner of Blue Dot Strategy. During his 20-year consulting career, he's provided strategic counsel to well-recognized brands such as FedEx, Nike, and Kraft. Lisa Mattam. Ms. Mattam is leading Canadian entrepreneur, having established 2 successful businesses, the Mattam Group consulting firm and the natural skincare line Sahajan. She is a frequent commentator on entrepreneurship, resilience, and the advancement of women and diversity. Moderating the panel is Dave Scandiffio. Mr. Scandiffio is the President and CEO of CIBC Asset Management. He is responsible for the overall retail and institutional asset management business, as well as the portfolio management team. He is passionate about learning about how bias and unconscious bias affect leadership and finding solutions for its disruption. Dave, it's my pleasure to turn the Canadian Club of Toronto podium over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Pam. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Certainly through your presence, I think you're acknowledging the importance of this topic. And it really is, unfortunately, we're seeing evidence daily of inequity, bias societally, and it's a significant issue for us. I mean, I think I was talking to Pam just before. Personally, it starts from a standpoint of fairness, and we're going to talk about some data up front on where we have a lack of fairness, if you will, in terms of opportunity for people. But really, and it could end there just at fairness, but it doesn't. Really, it's a business issue. It's a societal issue. It's about unlocking the human potential, if you will, in our organization. So what we wanted to talk about as a group is what we can do as leaders and what our role needs to be, both to have a discussion, and it's important to have the discussion, but to move beyond discussion to action across the organizations that we all lead. So thank you all for being part, and on behalf of the Canadian Club and our panelists, I thank you for participating today. So maybe to start things off, just to frame things, we thought it'd be important to give a little bit of data to the organization, to the group here. And when we look at it, and we all think of, I think rightly so, we're very proud of Canada and Toronto specifically being a very multicultural, very open society. We see evidence of other societies and other groups where it's maybe traveling in the wrong direction. But even there, when we look at our own corporate results, and some of the statistics, we see some stark data that points back at us and says we're not where we really need to be. So if we look at it and there's multiple lenses we can use in terms of thinking about diversity, but 2 major ones being gender and being visible minorities, both of which groups, within the GTA and the Toronto area represent each and of themselves more than 50% of the workforce. And then we compare that to the number of roles that we have in executive leadership and on boards, we have a long way to go to get to anywhere close to the 50%. So just some data for you. You know, there's a 2017 Osler report when we look at gender, and it identified that women, although being over 50% of the workforce, represent only 16% of the executive positions at TSX-listed firms, and that's down from 18% just a year ago. So unfortunately, heading in the wrong direction on that one. And similarly, when it comes to board positions, on average, TSX 60 listed firms only have one female board member, and actually 30% of firms do not have any female board members. The data is even more stark when we look at visible minorities. So a 2017 Ryerson study, so thank you to Ryerson for doing this work, shows when it comes to visible minorities, again, visible minorities represent more than 50% of the workforce. When it comes to executive positions, 9% of executive roles within Toronto-listed firms are with visible minorities. And when it comes to board positions, it's only 3% of overall directors that are visible minorities. And there are actually 90% of corporate boards do not have a single visible minority on their board. So a long way for us to go. And in a society that we think of ourselves as a very progressive and open society, I think everyone else thinks that too. And so part of the discussion here is about kind of having more discussion on those things that are not that conscious to us, where we have biases or where we've been operating in a certain way and we need to disrupt that. So I thank our panelists for joining us, and I think we're all on side on wanting to make some change here. Maybe to start things off, I'm going to turn to Scott first, who's done a fair bit of work as a consultant on leaderships broadly with organizations. And I think when it comes to bias, you know, it's important for us, you know, we all have a brain, we all have biases, we're all wired, we're imperfect human beings who make decisions, and we have these, you know, unconscious biases. So you know, I'm wondering if Scott, you could talk a little bit about the neuroscience and what it tells us as a positive in terms of ways we need to work to disrupt it, and where there's some dangers in focusing maybe too much on the study of those kinds of biases.
Sure. Sure. First off, thank you for the opportunity and the privilege of talking with you today and addressing this topic. In the work that we do around strategy design, business model design, leadership development, change management, unconscious bias shows up everywhere. Now, our focus today is on its impact on diversity and inclusion, but unconscious bias is actually a much bigger thing because we have multiple biases that impact how we see things, what we notice, how we interpret what is happening, and how we make decisions. And one of the fundamental points that I try to live with myself and encourage leaders to own is this is a universal phenomenon. As David mentioned, it is part of how our brains are structured and wired, how they have evolved. In fact, it evolved for survival reasons. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that most of the day we're operating on an unconscious level. We have to do that to manage the flood of information that comes our way. And there are reasons why we tend to have a tribal outlook. And if you think the evolution of our species, being part of a tribe was a better way of surviving and passing your genes on into the next generation. You know, 50,000 years ago, when our current brain structure evolved, so scientists, neuroscientists tell us, when you encountered another tribe, that was usually not a positive situation. You were at risk. And so our brains have developed what I simply refer to as a tribal mentality. We have two biases that impact us greatly when we are interacting with others. One is a negativity bias. So when I encounter someone who is other, we tend to start from a negativity place. And we have a special part of our brain, several systems, but one of the systems we have is your amygdala, which is constantly scanning for threats unconsciously. And if we are very sensitive to threats, it notices negative situations, potential negative situations, much more keenly than it notices positive situations. So we are already coming in with this sort of negative, I'm going to be cautious attitude. And then we have another bias called the affinity bias, which is that if I find something that is similar to you, I like you more. And again, this operates unconsciously. We've all experienced this. You know, when you go to a party and you find somebody who went to the same college or university that you did, if you tune in, they're sort of like this, oh, really? You know, and you feel this little connection all of a sudden. So you've got negativity on one side, affinity on the other side, evolved for great reasons, but now in our society end up often causing a lot of pain and a lot of unnecessary exclusion rather than inclusion. Now, I think we have to accept this reality. If we do not accept every single one of us in this room, that's how your brain works. In fact, I will sometimes say, how do you know that you suffer from unconscious bias? Well, you can answer it with one question. Do you have a brain? If you have a brain, you are biased. If we do not accept this as the fundamental way that our brains are structured, we will not take this issue seriously. And most of us, I would wager, you know, the vast, vast majority of us in this room, particularly because you chose to come to this event, you have conscious, positive orientations. You want to be inclusive, genuinely. You want to be fair, because you know it's right. You also probably know it's good business. That's not sufficient, because with the best of intentions, we may have open hearts, but unfortunately, we have tribal minds.
That's great. And maybe I'll turn to Lisa. Lisa, you've got a breadth of experience, both working as a consultant, now as an entrepreneur. You know, and I was alluding earlier to some of the risks associated with understanding these biases, and I think some of the research has shown that organizations really need to be quite intentional in terms of the approach that they take in understanding and disrupting those biases. Can you maybe talk about some of those themes and what in your experience?
Sure. So just to provide some context, so I started my career in the corporate world, in the pharmaceutical industry, and much probably like many of you ended up as a diversity champion, or I worked in the advancement of women, and I was doing a lot of work. And so when I started my consulting practice, I went in it with the intention of doing leadership work, but there was so much work that needed to be done in the area of diversity, in the area of advancement of women, and it was such an area of personal passion that I thought, okay, this is the work I want to do, this is the research I want to understand, this is all of those things. And then the entrepreneurial bug hit again, and I started another business, but I stopped and I said, wow, in the 10 years I was consulting, we actually didn't move as far as I would have thought, and now I have this incredible platform to continue to do the work. And so people sometimes say to me, you run a skincare business, you know, why do you care about unconscious bias? And I said, because now in my new world of, you know, getting rounds of financing and meeting with suppliers and pitching, I continue to experience it as a lived experience. And so it's amazing that it's something that we can't shut ourselves down to. And so, you know, when we had an initial discussion last week in preparation for the session, one of the things we were saying is, as organizations, one of the things we first do is we say, we need training. And I'll be the first one to say, like, please train. We all need to be employed. But you know, we need training. We need a speaker. We need all of these things. But then what we do is we then go and say, oh, great, we've done it. Like, we've checked off the box. You know, good news, you know, 20% of all of our leaders have experienced, you know, the disrupting bias session. You know, we're going to announce it at all of our town halls, and then we're done. And that, in fact, is the issue. I had an opportunity to speak at a legal professionals conference a couple years ago, and the question that was proposed to me unexpectedly was, you know, why do you think we haven't made strides with women in the legal profession as we would have expected? And I had to think about it sort of on the cuff, and my answer was, because we actually haven't done the work. We come to conferences and we say these are all the issues, and I read this, you know, amazing stat a couple weeks ago that said that there are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs. Like, just think about that for a second. But I know I have a lot of cousins named John, so I sent that to them. But the reality is we've identified the issue, but we haven't been willing to invest in the long-term strategy that addresses it. We haven't been willing to say, how are we going to hold ourselves accountable to this? Are we actually willing to put our hands up and say, hey, I noticed that this slate of candidates is not diverse. What are we doing differently? Are we willing to say, hey, that thing that you just said, that's actually off base, And that's not going to be something we're going to tolerate here. You know, are we willing to open ourselves up and really hold ourselves accountable to the things that are actually going to shift the way we do our business every day? And I think that's going to become the ongoing challenge for us. You know, we know that any change, whether it's diversity related or just change in an organization, it needs a business case. It needs an executive team that believes in the change. It needs an employee base that believes in the change. But then it needs a plan. And it needs a plan with an accountability that continues to get assessed over and over again, so that you've got somebody actually saying, here's what we've accomplished, here's what we've done. You know, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. And if you don't continue to hold yourself accountable for that, you'll never actually move.
Excellent points. And I think one of the things we're going to come back at the end of the panel and talk about the practical experience, because I think, well, it's good to have the discussion as we're talking about it, and necessary to have the discussion. And sometimes I think it takes a while for people, for it to sink in, the depth of and the complexity of the issue. It's important to do that. It's also critically important that we don't just have platitudes and talk about these things, that we're actually measuring and working towards a plan on those things. So, Renée, one of the things we've talked about is kind of this unconscious bias, and I alluded to it earlier. One of the risks is you can just explain it away and kind of, okay, now, oh no, it's fine for me to act that way. That's the way I'm programmed. But we, as we had our prep call, you also highlighted, let's also call out there's a fair bit of conscious bias that we see as well. And in any case, I wouldn't mind getting your take on, we talked about some of the stats before. Where are we in terms of progress on either recognizing the unconscious bias, calling out the conscious bias from your standpoint, and what are some of the key things we need to do to kind of keep moving the needle drastically in the right direction?
Yeah, to Lisa's point, I think if I netted this out, I would say that we're not as far as we need to be. But what we see at CCDI in terms of just looking at organizations overall is that the reason we're having such extensive conversation about unconscious bias is because, for the most part, it lets us off the hook. How can I be responsible if I'm not aware that I'm treating you based on who you are with disrespect? And so it is important for us to think about what's out there blatantly that we as a society hand clasp about. So I think it is important in a conversation about unconscious bias for us to pay attention to the reliable sources that are feeding us bias that is right in front of us. So think about who your influencers are, for example. And certainly the one I'll pick on for a limited time is media. I'd invite you to consider one media story, look at a number of different outlets, and you will see the blatant bias inherent in how they're reporting that information. Do we as a society, or even in a local community, actually take action to object to the things that are becoming commonplace? So it is important for us to think about, what are we actually talking about here? All right, so unconscious, and we're really focusing on that, but what's there day to day that we in fact just accept without an objection? Also, I think it's important for us to think about, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about bias being related to diversity and inclusion, but the truth of the matter is, and from the introduction, we're talking a numbers game here and thinking that that's representative. So it is important for us to distinguish terminology and not confuse representation in the numbers game with what actually is defined as diversity and what it means for us to be inclusive. Because if we're not conscious of those subtle differentials, we end up talking about, women's representation or the dearth of representation for particular groups. And so if we're really talking about inclusion, I think it's really important for us to consider every single person in this room. And I notice that not everybody is a woman or a person of color. So I think it is important for us to drill down, be aware that this is a conversation, as you suggested, the other panelists suggested, about all of us, and how do we, in fact, take action to ensure that each of us is brought along to a place where we're ready to actually address these issues, and we're not just playing the shuffle numbers game as one of the measures.
Excellent. And I think it was something we were talking about just at the lunch earlier, that idea, you really can diminish the cause and the importance of it when you look at just the numbers, or you give an easy out sometimes for people and they start thinking about quotas. And I think, a subtle thing I know our organization has done is change the order from diversity and inclusion, where you talk about diversity metrics up front, to really about being inclusive leadership. And that's, and when that happens, the metrics should line up. If you really are open, you should have your groups and your talent pool at different levels should line up closer to where your overall population is, because then you're maximizing the potential across the organization. But it comes from a point of being inclusive, and inclusive of people who are very diverse or different. So, and one of the things I know, Renée, you brought up at our table was the risk of you have somebody who fits the bill in terms of either being the right gender or the right person of color, but really is not different in terms of bringing a different perspective, because they're acting in a way that is still conforming to what we say is the important way for us to move ahead. So it's I think a subtle thing, but an important difference for us to really be aiming to get inclusivity. So maybe just to move to practicality. So what does that mean? I think hopefully we get everybody on side that these are important principles, that we move as an organization, you get the right tone across the organization. But what have you guys seen in terms of organizations either you've been in or you've been working with that has been most effective or not effective, if you will? And maybe if I can turn first to you, Lisa, and any examples of things that are practical examples that we as leaders here can bring back to our organizations or the way we interact day to day.
Sure. So there's two that come to mind, actually. So one is an example from PepsiCo, and this is actually, again, probably taking me back 10 years, but PepsiCo, they had a very right business case for diversity and inclusion. One, they wanted to become an employer of choice, but two, they also recognized not only was the landscape of Canada changing, but the Canadian palate was changing. 20 years ago, we weren't all going out for sushi and Thai food and Ethiopian, but now we require it in our chips. And so they needed it. They needed to bring some innovative thinking into the organization as well. And so this became a very important part of what they did. Where I credit them is that they took it that step further. And so one of the things that they did, interestingly, was every people manager had diversity and inclusion on their metrics. And so they had to actually not only say how they were delivering against the business and not only say all the different things that they get assessed for, but they also had to demonstrate how they were delivering against moving along the agenda of diversity and inclusion. And whatever their strategy was focused on, particularly for that year, there might be some extra guidance of what that could look like or what some things, what they could do, but they were measured against it. So it wasn't part of an aside project. It wasn't, we have the tendency to be like, this is our year of diversity, and then next year is the year of innovation, and next year is the year of environment. But this is part of what we do every day, and so we're going to assess you against that. And so I think, again, being able to really instill that long-term accountability against diversity and inclusion becomes really important. And it shows an entire employee base that, hey, we care about this. And it's as important as the other things that we're doing. And the second example I would say on the other side is I recently had a conversation with a good friend who is interviewing for a very, very senior role. And, which is amazing. And so as he was going through the interview process, one of the things he happened to share, not from a D&I perspective, more as an observation, was because probably of the seniority of the role, all of his interviews were chats. They weren't interviews. They were, you're going to chat with this person, you're going to chat with the person you'd be reporting to in the US, you're going to chat with this person, you're going to chat with that person. And chats are great, but to the earlier point that Scott made is we all have a tendency to like people who are like us. It's that whole sort of, you're like me, it feels good, right? Like you went to Western, I went to Western, that feels good. You come from North Toronto, I come from North Toronto, it feels good, whatever it is. And so as I was hearing that, one of the things I was thinking is because of the lack of structure in these chats, who's being brought in and who's being left out? Simply by the fact that they may not fit in the chat, or that the chat might not have all come to be. And I know it isn't exclusive to that one opportunity. I've done a lot of work in law firms, and sometimes the tendency is, we're bringing people in for new associate recruitment, and they're just going to go and meet with a series of partners, or we're going to do a panel interview, but there's no structure to the panel interview. And so, again, it becomes, whether or not we mean it, we're assessing on what we perceive as fit. Mm-hmm. What we perceive is, it might be you look like me, you feel like me, I'm a partner and I've been successful because I played hockey and I did this and I'm really sociable, therefore you seem to exhibit the same things, I'm going to bring you in. So one of the things I would challenge the organizations who are here moving forward is across the spectrum of your hiring, where can you put in some real systems and processes that force you out of that, this just feels really good, and therefore I'm going to bring you in? And where can you actually put some processes that say, here are the questions we're going to ask, here are the competencies, no matter how high up you are in the organization, so that we're conscious of the fact that we are bringing people in at all levels.
Excellent points. And your point on the recruiting reminds me, too, of, just thinking about the mentorship and sponsorship that we do and how that naturally occurs, and how, without thinking about it, we're biasing certain groups and cutting off other groups who we are not giving that same opportunity to learn about other functions, to progress in their careers as well. So something I think that you're not thinking about by having people go for a beer at the end of the day or going to a sporting event, you're making a conscious choice that is cutting off parts of your human capital that aren't really getting those same opportunities. So some good food for thought. Scott, you work with a number of different clients on leadership. Any observations from your standpoint?
Yes, my head is swimming with things that I can say at the moment. So to try to be brief, I want to point out something that I have become much more aware of in the last 4 years, which is even when we are working in the field of diversity and inclusion, I like this idea that it's actually inclusion. I often say diversity is the door, but it's inclusion that actually unlocks the experience. Even when I've worked with folks in this field and we talk about gender, there's a default to that means we're talking about women. And I have a transgendered stepchild now, having married recently. And I'm even in our field, I'm often surprised that when we're talking about gender diversity, nobody is thinking about transgender. It's still male-female. So, it's so easy for all of us to not see the biases that are there. And this isn't, I struggle with answering the practical side of this because some of it is practical, but some of it is personal. It's both. And I think it starts, I am tired of diversity and inclusion being seen as an HR issue. It's a leadership issue. And it has to start with the senior leadership in an organization if it is going to get rooted and take hold in the organization. So when talking with senior leaders, I'm thinking right now, there's a company that I worked with a couple of years ago that was in the automotive industry. And this is not an industry known for high representation of other genders. But the senior team, 6 out of 7 white males, and I represent the older white male crowd. I'm very aware of that. They thankfully got the message, and it was encouraging to see that they were serious about trying to shift a lot of the organization's dynamics and increase both representation and inclusion. It's been a slow journey for them, but it began when they made the decision that they as leaders really were going to own their biases, both conscious and unconscious. And one of the practical ways that showed up is they instituted, call me when you see it. And so they've had some very candid conversations, and it's been painful at times. It's not fun when you are called on stuff. But it's been one of the fundamental things. But that started from a personal commitment with them to say, I am really going to own this. Now, the other thing that I've seen in several organizations, and I think some of the research now is bearing this out very strongly, it's easier, not easy, it's easier to mitigate the impact of unconscious bias by removing it from your processes and structures than from people. Because we're all going to have unconscious bias the rest of our lives about many, many things, not just diversity and inclusion. So to create the kinds of structures, we know, probably most of you know about, blinding in hiring processes. But it doesn't all have to be formal stuff. You know, David, you mentioned, you know, the going out golfing with your buddies kind of thing. Well, that's a very older white male kind of typical thing, right? You can have informal structures in team meetings. One group I worked with, you know, they instituted 3 rules in their team. 1, everybody speaks if they want to on an issue. Number 2, nobody interrupts. And number 3, we always ask, what are we missing and whose voice are we not hearing? Mm-hmm. Now, that's an informal structure. It doesn't take HR to change a policy on that. It's just a commitment to certain structural rules. It's not a guarantee, but at least the rules are keeping it aware. But again, you know, it comes down to the leader then actually enforcing the rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent points. Renee?
Well, I think as leaders, we often don't know what we don't know. And so if you think about the organization itself, and we're very simple at CCDI, we keep things simple. Think about the overall environment when you're thinking about the consciousness of where bias is placed or where it lives. And so I think it's really important that we organizations establish, and certainly we're doing this with our employer partners, it's how do you measure this stuff, right? So from 2 perspectives. One is workforce, the other is workplace. So to begin to put in the rigorous discipline of being able to truly identify from a knowledge place and not I'm guessing what's going on in my organization, actually to do the work, to Lisa's point, is to take action. Actually put into place those structures where you're doing measurement. So that, and please use deep dive demographics when you do this, because what it allows you to do from an attitudinal point of view is to understand the differentials in experience between groups who are represented in your workplace. I'd invite you to consider that perhaps women and men may have somewhat different experiences of the workplace. Just saying. So if you have factual information to go on, it allows you, as we've talked about, to put in a strategy that actually addresses the bias that's inherent in your organization. So we can, at a very high level, say, oh yeah, we know that we all have biases, but what are they? And what's the impact on the people who live in my organization? So as leaders, we're responsible for the caliber of the workplace environment. But if we don't have real data to go on, it becomes a guessing game, and we run the potential of not moving the organization forward in terms of our vision of it being inclusive. So I think it's really important. And secondly, so that's sort of the organizational, let's be really clear about what the issues are. The other thing I'd invite you to consider is the personal aspect as you're talking about. How do I know where I am on any continuum when it comes to unconscious or conscious bias? So self-assessment here becomes increasingly important. My observation, and we were talking a little bit about where we are on this journey before, but my observation is that when you do that individual assessment, intercultural diversity inventories, what you find out is personally where you are. And so some of our experience has been, as great as we think we all are, a lot of us are in denial about the fact that we actually have bias. And as human beings, we know we can rationalize anything. So it becomes important for us to actually have an objective way of looking at our belief systems and, as leaders, how we create high caliber environments where people can be their genuine selves. So I think those are 2 things that we're seeing really start to get entrenched. And it becomes easier to make an argument about why you should do that because you are dealing with objective assessors. And it's not, oh yeah, I just think this. Mm-hmm. So I think those 2 make a real difference.
Excellent. Well, just feeding back on all of the comments you're making, and thinking about within our organization where we have a senior leader who's very much owning it and committing to it. I think a big thing from my standpoint that has worked positively is identifying the fact that it is a corporate, it is a business objective. This is not a separate HR initiative. Identifying being inclusive as the main way that we lead as an organization. Measuring those things. But on top of that, I think identifying the role and importance that for example, myself as a white male leader needs to play, and that there's opportunity for us to be inclusive leaders. We need inclusive leaders to lead diverse teams, and if we do that, we're going to have better overall results. So by that, it takes away back to your to the neuroscience, the threat part, that, oh, wait a minute, I'm excluded, I'm on the outside. It's no, there is an opportunity for anybody who is going to be inclusive in the organization, and it's up to us to try to go unlock that. So I think some very good observations. We have a question from the floor, which is, and I'll put it out to any of you who want to take it first, which is, how do you think the Weinstein era will affect bias in the workplace, and not just in Hollywood? So, at one level, very obviously disruptive, very upsetting to see these things. And I'll just give you one observation from my standpoint, which I guess it's sad, but I think in some cases not being conscious of it, not realizing how pervasive it was. What is the impact that it has? And we had a training session called Men Advocating Real Change, where we had an exercise where everybody was standing on one side of the room, and then they mentioned a number of points that were brought up that talked about different biases or situations. And one of them was, I've been subjected to some sort of sexual either assault or a situation where I was uncomfortable in the workplace. And the reaction from the men when they saw virtually all of the women cross the room, which shouldn't have been that much of an eye-opener, but it was. To me, it seems like this is a bit of a game changer, but I'd be interested to hear from you how you view this. Obviously a very negative impact, but maybe it can be a change agent for us. So anybody want to take that on first?
Well, I'll start there because This is one of my areas of expertise, and certainly I've received a lot of phone calls asking for comment about the Weinstein era. But can I just ask how many women would raise their hands and say me too who are in this room? So, hello. The idea that organizations and the people who lead them are unaware of this, to your point, is extremely shocking, but not so much if you've been doing this for over 30 years like I have. I do workplace harassment investigations, but the truth of the matter is, I think the solution is the level of consciousness. It's also the willingness of organizations to act when people cross the line. I've done workplace harassment investigations where my recommendation as an outside investigator is to terminate certain perpetrators, and I can tell you in some organizations they are still working there because they're rainmakers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question becomes, where are our values in this? And certainly I would suggest that we're luckier in Canada because our laws are more stringent, but in terms of organizational culture and our willingness to take this on, people are nervous. They're more than nervous. They're scared and quaking in their boots. But this is where, to your point, this is where real leadership comes into play. So if we're not willing to address these organizations, we're kidding ourselves about the idea that we're building inclusive organizations. Because if they don't fundamentally deal with respect for each and every person, we're never going to get to our goal, ever. I've said enough.
That's good. Lisa or Scott?
Well,
any
I think that, so actually I'll start with a story, which is last night I belonged to a mastermind group, and we're 8 different women. We run different businesses, and we all kind of serve as each other's support, board of advisors, all of these types of things. And last night was our we didn't have a holiday Christmas dinner, we did it last night, and this topic came up. And what was interesting was the range around the room of 8 women saying, and then there was this time, and there was this time, and there was this time when I was, started my business, or this time when I was a young lawyer, or this time when I was doing my MBA, or whatever it was. And there was not enough hours in the evening for people to share their examples of when they've experienced it. And so I share that story to say that I think it's important that we're willing to listen to those stories. I think it's important that we're willing to say that these things, they do happen and they're prominent. And because Harvey Weinstein and, every morning I wake up and I think, oh my gosh, which one of my favorite stars is going down next? I'm almost afraid, because you realize that the door is now being opened to some of the things that we weren't willing to see. And so I think as organizations, we have to be willing to hear those stories. We have to be willing to take action. But we also have to be conscientious of the fact that there's going to be around it a lot of murky issues, right? There's going to be people who say, oh, I don't want to, I don't want to be alone in a room with a woman because I don't want to be, I want to play Mike Pence or whatever it is. And so we have to be willing to navigate and really put our stake in the ground and say, what are our values? What are we going to stand for? And we are 100% going to action on that. So if somebody's a rainmaker, but they do things that are inappropriate, I'm sorry, there's no place for you here. There is no place for you here. And we continue to see over and over and over in organizations that we have these beautiful values on the wall and we stand up for these sort of credos that we live by, but when push comes to shove, we're not necessarily willing to action them. There's a limit, or we'll give someone a slap on the hand, or we're going to send them to meet with someone to talk about their issues. And the other learned experience of that for women, and this is something that I continue to hear, and I heard last night, was, well, then maybe I just won't talk about it, and maybe it's just part of working. And I think that in and of itself becomes an issue. So I think we have to be clear on what our values are, but we have to know that there are going to be some people, when we have that clarity, who are going to be uncomfortable, who are not going to be sure how to navigate, who there may be some backlash to that, but we have to be willing to do it.
But maybe just on that, so do you feel this incident, as horrible as it is, but has it opened up to people being more open to it, or feeling that their organizations are more likely to react? Because to me, it would seem like for business reasons, I think businesses, and not just justice reasons, which hopefully you'd have enough just there, organizations are taking these things more seriously. But is there a flip side that people are worried that I'm going to open up Pandora's box if I also come out? Or do you think it's net been a progressive thing in terms of the discussion?
I think it's both. I think people are concerned about opening up Pandora's box. I think, naturally, when Renee asks the question, who can raise their hand, there's going to be still a number of people who don't want to raise their hand, who, whether for safety reasons or just, I don't want to be the one who stirs the pot in the organization and becomes the one who complained about, it could be X woman or X man. Like it's not just, just exclusive to men as the perpetrators. So I think that, I guess what I'm saying is I think it's positive, but we can't expect and we can't put the onus on the people who've experienced it to be the ones to fight for it. I think it's a requirement of leaders. I think the other thing, and I don't mean to get political in any way, but is I think we have to acknowledge that we're in an environment where some people still think that's okay. Like the day after the American election, I'm pretty comfortable saying this, like I was depressed. Like it was hard for me to get out of bed, and you don't have to agree with my politic and any of that kind of stuff. But for me, the reason it was so sad is because, put everything else aside, what it felt like for me was that knowing all of these issues, people chose, whether it's the economy and all these other things, over what felt to me as human rights. And so that's my experience, and you don't have to agree with that. I don't ask everybody to do that. But we have to know when those conversations are happening south of the border that they exist here. We just know as Canadians not to say them out loud. And so we have to be willing to know that there are going to be people in our organizations who, whether it's on sexual assault, whether it's on gender, whether it's on bias, are going to have views that don't necessarily align with the things that we're talking about, but know better or feel that we don't have the right environment to express that. And so I just raise that to say, this isn't an easy road if we really want to go down it, but I think we have no choice and we should be compelled, and I challenge you to go down it.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, so I appreciate very much all the comments of our panelists. I'd like to thank the Canadian Club for hosting this event and for taking on this topic. I think it's an important topic. Again, thank the panelists for really opening up in terms of the topic. And I ask, and I think I challenge everybody here. I think, again, your presence here is showing that you have a commitment and an interest in this subject. I think it's collectively all of our jobs as leaders to continue to move the needle. So hopefully the discussion today has given you some more food for thought. So thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation today. My name is Colleen Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Club Toronto. Distinguished panelists, thank you on behalf of the club. Thank you for engaging us on a thought-provoking and important topic. You illuminated for us the critical role that unconscious bias can play in leadership decisions. Your examples demonstrated the importance of being mindful of the extent to which our biases influence the way we operate. We also appreciated the strategies and approaches you shared. They require us to be more aware, sensitive, and, well, conscious. Given the rich diversity of our population and the need to create inclusive workplaces, leaders cannot afford to ignore this issue any longer. Lisa, Renée, and Scott, your passion of purpose is inspiring. And to our moderator, David, we appreciate your facilitation of a richly rewarding dialogue. Thank you. Now on to a bit of business before we conclude. Some highlights of upcoming club events. On Monday, January 29th, we welcome George Cope, President and CEO of BC Inc. and Bell Canada, who will talk about their recent Bell Let's Talk announcement that's coming up and mental health in the workplace. And then on Friday, February 9th, we welcome Indira Naidu-Harris, who is currently the Minister responsible for early years childcare and the status of women, and hopefully she will still be that portfolio. No, maybe she won't. We'll see what she'll talk about, but I'm sure it will be really illuminating and exciting for us. So to order your tickets or to learn more about the club, please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You will find a podcast and webcast of today's event and pictures, and as well as all of our past events. So we welcome you to explore the depth of knowledge that we have there. You can also join the conversation by following us on Twitter and Instagram at CDNCLUBTO or using that hashtag. I would like to extend another thanks to CIBC for supporting this important event today. Thank you. We would also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for streaming today's event. Thank you all so much for being with us today. We hope to see you again soon. Have a wonderful afternoon.